General Hospital spoilers reveal that Jocelyn could feel her pulse quicken the moment she caught sight of Britt, the shock of the encounter landing like a physical jolt. For a heartbeat. The rest of the world fell away, the crowded corridors of the Five Poppies Resort, the background hum of strangers' voices. Even the constant awareness that she was in the middle of an active WSB operation. None of it mattered, because standing only a few feet away was the woman she had once believed dead. The woman who had thrown herself into danger to save Joss's life and paid the ultimate price for it, or so everyone in Port Charles had thought. It wasn't just the relief of seeing Britt alive that overwhelmed her, it was the sudden, fierce joy of knowing that a piece of her past, one she had mourned, was here in front of her, breathing. Moving, existing. For an instant, Joss let herself imagine what it would be like to take Britt by the hand and lead her straight back to Port Charles. To walk into the Metro Court and watch everyone's disbelief melt into happiness as they realized she had come home. But the warmth of that fantasy was short-lived. The weight of reality settled on her almost immediately, dragging her mind back to the reason she was here in the first place. This wasn't a personal visit. This was a mission. Carefully orchestrated by the WSB, and Britt's unexpected survival was no coincidence. The agency had known, or at least suspected, she was alive. And that knowledge had been a part of their strategy all along. Joss had been sent to this place with a specific objective. One that now stood in direct conflict with the surge of gratitude and loyalty she felt toward Britt. The mission didn't frame Britt as a friend to be reunited with but as an asset, a complication. Maybe even a threat that needed to be neutralized or controlled. The longer Joss stood there, the more her thoughts began to spiral. She remembered the night of the Hook attacks in painful detail. The sudden appearance of Heather Weber, the flash of the poisoned weapon, the feeling of absolute certainty that she was about to die, and then Britt, moving faster than anyone could react. Stepping between her and death. The cost of that moment had seemed unbearable at the time. Joss had lived, but Britt hadn't made it home. Now here she was. Alive and working for a mysterious benefactor tied to the very operation the WSB had dropped into Joss's lap. The mission's parameters suddenly felt like shackles. Every line of the briefing echoing in her mind like a reminder that she had been sent here to execute orders, not to rewrite them. It was becoming clear that Britt's position was far more precarious than Joss had realized. The WSB wanted her cooperation, and they were willing to exert pressure to get it. The agency's quiet but unmistakable manipulations, the subtle restrictions, the constant monitoring, the strategic isolation, had already begun to box Britt into a corner. If Joss did nothing, the mission would proceed exactly as intended, with Britt being leveraged into compliance or removed entirely if she resisted. That thought ignited something fierce in Joss. A determination that she couldn't easily explain, even to herself. She owed Britt her life, and that debt wasn't something she could file away under professional obligations. Yet with every minute she spent in Britt's presence, the conflict inside her deepened. She could feel the pull of her WSB training, the emphasis on discipline, loyalty, and completing the mission above all else, warring with the instinct to protect Britt at any cost. This wasn't some faceless target or an abstract objective. This was Britt. The woman who had once laughed with her over shared frustrations, who had rolled her eyes at Port Charles gossip. Who had been human and flawed and brave in ways that had left a lasting mark on Joss's heart. Every smile, every glance. Every reminder of who Britt really was made the idea of betraying her feel like a wound Joss might never recover from. It was the kind of dilemma that could break a person. On one side was the WSB. An organization that had taken her under its wing, trusted her with an assignment of real importance, and shaped her into someone capable of operating in dangerous, high-stakes situations. To defy them wasn't just to risk her career, it was to invite consequences that could follow her for the rest of her life. On the other side was Britt. A woman who had already risked everything for her once before, who was now caught in a situation that seemed poised to swallow her whole. Joss couldn't ignore the feeling that if she turned her back now, if she chose the mission over the person, she would be betraying not only Britt but herself. As she stood there, Joss began to see the trap for what it was. The WSB had counted on her ability to separate personal feelings from professional duty, but they hadn't accounted for the depth of her bond with Britt. That bond was both her greatest strength and her greatest vulnerability, and the agency had placed her in a position where choosing wrong, in their eyes, could cost her everything. She could picture the aftermath of each choice: follow orders, and Britt would likely be taken deeper into the WSB's control, perhaps never to return to Port Charles, defy orders. And Joss could find herself cut off, hunted even, with the full weight of the agency turned against her. What made the decision even harder was the realization that Britt herself might not see the situation the same way. She had survived on her own for years now, carving out a place in a world far removed from Port Charles, building ties to a benefactor whose intentions remained murky. Joss didn't know whether Britt would even want to return home, or whether she would see Joss's intervention as a rescue or an intrusion. That uncertainty gnawed at her. The last thing she wanted was to strip Britt of the autonomy she had fought so hard to preserve. And yet, the image of Britt back in Port Charles, safe and surrounded by people who loved her, was a vision Joss couldn't shake. Every conversation they shared became an exercise in restraint, Joss measuring her words, trying to read between the lines of Britt's guarded responses. Was there a part of her that missed home? Was she hiding a desire to leave, or had she truly moved on? The answers mattered, because they would shape the path Joss took next. But time was not on her side. The WSB's patience was finite. And every day Britt remained at the resort without committing to their terms increased the risk that the agency would take matters into its own hands. The emotional strain began to bleed into every aspect of Joss's behavior. She found herself lying awake at night, replaying the day's events, weighing the consequences of each possible move. She could feel the lines between personal loyalty and professional duty blurring, her mind caught in an endless loop of what-ifs and worst-case scenarios. The idea of returning to Port Charles without Britt felt unbearable, but so did the thought of burning her bridges with the WSB. And so Joss remained trapped in the middle. Her joy at seeing Britt alive tempered by the cold reality that bringing her home might require breaking every rule she had agreed to follow. The longer she stayed in this limbo, the more she realized that there might be no perfect solution, only choices that would change her life and Britt's forever. As the mission edged toward its inevitable climax, Jocelyn knew that whatever decision she made would not just determine Britt's fate, but define her own identity as both an agent and a person. And somewhere deep inside, she understood that the moment she acted, there would be no going back. The tension between Jocelyn and the WSB is no longer just an undercurrent hidden beneath the surface of her mission, it has become a living, breathing force that shapes every moment of her work and every interaction she has with the people around her. What started as minor discomfort with the agency's rigid rules and carefully orchestrated strategies has evolved into a full-scale conflict of values, where every order feels like a challenge to her independence and every debriefing is laced with unspoken mistrust. The shift has been gradual, marked by subtle changes in tone and expression. But now it's undeniable. Jocelyn is no longer the eager recruit who believed the WSB's cause was hers. She is an operative in name, but her loyalty is increasingly fractured, split between the institution that trained her and the personal convictions that have always guided her sense of right and wrong. One of the key adjustments that has brought this tension to a boiling point is the WSB's insistence on controlling the Britt situation from a purely strategic standpoint, while Jocelyn views it through the lens of deep personal history. To the agency, Britt is an asset, a resource to be leveraged for maximum operational gain, or, if necessary, a liability to be neutralized. To Jocelyn, Britt is the woman who once stepped into harm's way to save her life. Someone whose fate cannot simply be reduced to a line item on a classified mission report. Every time the WSB pushes her to treat Britt as an objective instead of a person, Jocelyn feels the friction grow sharper, the invisible tether between her and the agency pulled taut to the point of snapping. This ongoing conflict has already produced its share of shocks. Jocelyn has been forced to accept that the WSB will not always tell her the whole truth, that they will withhold information, manipulate outcomes, and make decisions that prioritize their goals over human cost. Each time she uncovers another hidden layer, the trust she once had in the organization erodes further. These moments hit hard. Not just because of what they reveal about the WSB, but because of what they demand from her, the choice to comply or to resist. Knowing that resistance comes with consequences she might not be ready to face. And yet, rather than breaking under these blows, Jocelyn finds herself hardening, her resolve deepening. She is learning how to absorb these shocks without letting them paralyze her, how to turn them into fuel for her own determination to protect what she believes in. But this adaptation comes with a cost. The more she resists the WSB's agenda, the more she begins to fixate on outmaneuvering them. On finding ways to achieve her own objectives without tipping her hand. What began as a moral stance has started to transform into something else, a strategic obsession that occupies her thoughts even when she's away from the mission. Every scenario she plays out in her mind involves anticipating the WSB's moves, identifying their weaknesses, and deciding when to bend their rules and when to break them entirely. She tells herself it's about protecting Britt, about making sure the right outcome is reached, but she can feel that it's also about proving to herself that she can beat the system at its own game. This fixation is dangerous, because it blurs the line between her role as an operative and her personal identity. The WSB expects unquestioning obedience. And though Jocelyn has not yet crossed the line into outright defiance, she is walking closer to it with every passing day. The agency's leadership is not blind to the shift. They can sense the changes in her tone, the questions that cut a little too close to the heart of their strategy, the slight hesitations before she agrees to an order. It is only a matter of time before they decide whether she is still an asset they can trust or a liability they need to control. For Jocelyn, this looming decision point is both a source of dread and a source of clarity. She knows that if she continues down this path, she will eventually be forced to choose between her allegiance to the WSB and her loyalty to Britt, and perhaps to herself. The very idea of walking away from the agency is daunting. Not only because of the danger it could put her in, but because it would mean redefining who she is and what she stands for. On the other hand, staying with the WSB while sacrificing her principles would mean living with a betrayal she could never forgive herself for. This is the tightrope she now walks. Balancing her role as an operative against the pull of her own conscience, knowing that one misstep could send her tumbling into consequences that will change her life forever. Every order, every meeting, every conversation with Britt is another step forward on that narrow path, and the stakes could not be higher. In the end, the greatest shock of all may not come from the WSB's next move or Britt's ultimate fate, but from the decision Jocelyn will have to make when she finally reaches the point where her two loyalties collide, and one of them has to break. Jocelyn had never set out to take a life. And the idea that Vaughn's blood was on her hands was something she could hardly reconcile with the person she thought she was. The moment itself had happened so quickly, so chaotically, that her mind still struggled to separate the flashes of movement, the pounding of her own heartbeat, and the sheer instinct that had driven her to act. Vaughn had been an obstacle in that instant. A looming threat to Britt in a situation where hesitation could have meant Britt's death. The decision, if it could even be called that, had been instantaneous, a reaction born of loyalty, fear, and the deep, unshakable bond she felt toward the woman who had once risked everything for her. By the time the dust settled, Vaughn was gone. And the enormity of what she had done began to settle over her like a lead weight. In the cold light of aftermath, nothing about it felt like a victory. Vaughn's absence was a silence that echoed in every corner of her mind, an empty space in the fabric of the mission that could not be patched over. She saw it in the subtle changes in the faces of those around her, the wary glances from WSB operatives who knew, or suspected, what had happened. The unspoken questions that lingered in every interaction. The agency's official stance was clinical, detached. Vaughn's death was collateral damage. Unfortunate but necessary in service of the mission. To them, it was a matter of record. To Jocelyn, it was a matter of conscience, and it would not be so easily filed away. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how the WSB's reaction was shaping her own. They had no interest in her guilt, only in whether she could continue to function as an asset. It was as if they were daring her to either accept their logic or remove herself from their ranks altogether. But Jocelyn couldn't do either. She couldn't walk away from the mission, not while Britt's safety still hung in the balance, and she couldn't bring herself to adopt the cold calculus that had allowed the agency to dismiss Vaughn's life so easily. This contradiction began to eat away at her, creating a split inside her that she could neither close nor ignore. It was in that fracture that a new obsession took root. Jocelyn found herself returning again and again to the scene in her mind, replaying every second, searching for a different path. A missed opportunity where she could have protected Britt without ending Vaughn's life. But no matter how many times she turned the events over, the outcome never changed. And the weight of inevitability only deepened her fixation. She began to see Vaughn's death not just as an accident, but as a defining moment, a point from which there was no turning back. A fracture line in her life that had split her into the person she was before and the person she was now. The more the WSB pushed her to move forward, the more determined she became to make Vaughn's death mean something. She told herself it was about justice, about making sure his death wasn't reduced to a statistic. But beneath that conviction was something rawer, more personal. Protecting Britt had been worth any cost in that moment. But living with the consequences meant finding a way to justify them, not to others, but to herself. That meant taking control of the narrative before the WSB could twist it into something unrecognizable. This drive began to shape her every move. She became more guarded with the agency, sharing less about her personal motivations, keeping her emotions tightly reined in when they were watching. She knew they already suspected her of prioritizing Britt over the mission, and she couldn't afford to give them more ammunition. But in private, the obsession continued to grow. She followed every scrap of intel that might help secure Britt's safety, even if it meant bending or breaking the rules. She began to see the mission not as the WSB's operation, but as her own, and that meant that if protecting Britt required her to defy orders again, she would do it without hesitation. And yet, beneath that steely resolve, the guilt remained, a constant hum beneath the surface of her thoughts. Vaughn's face would come to her in quiet moments, unbidden and unwelcome, a reminder that her choices had consequences that rippled far beyond the moment they were made. Sometimes she wondered if her obsession with protecting Britt was less about loyalty and more about atonement, a way to balance the scales. Even if no amount of success could ever truly erase what had happened. The truth was that she didn't know, and the not knowing was part of what kept her awake at night. Every encounter with Britt only deepened the conflict. Seeing her alive, knowing that Vaughn had died to make it so, filled Jocelyn with both gratitude and a gnawing sense of responsibility. It made the idea of failing her again unbearable, and that pressure was beginning to shape her into someone who operated less like a WSB operative and more like a lone agent, guided by her own moral compass and unshaken by the agency's rules. But that path was dangerous, and the WSB would not tolerate it forever. The real danger, however, was not from the agency but from herself. The obsession that had begun as a desire to protect Britt was evolving into something all-consuming. Something that clouded her judgment and narrowed her vision until every decision was made in service of a single goal. And while that goal might have been noble in its intention, Jocelyn was beginning to sense that it could lead her to places just as dark as the night Vaughn died, and that once she crossed that line again, there might be no way back. Jocelyn was no longer the same young woman who had once stepped into the ranks of the WSB with a mixture of ambition and naive belief in their cause. Those early days, when she thought she was part of something noble and necessary, felt like a distant memory now, blurred and faded beneath the weight of betrayal, manipulation, and an ever-tightening chain of control. The WSB had not simply trained her, they had shaped her, molded her into a tool they could wield for their own ends. And for too long she had allowed herself to be used under the assumption that the missions she carried out served a greater good. But recent events, especially the way they had handled Britt, Vaughn, and the aftermath of both, had stripped away any illusions she might have clung to. In their place was a cold, hard clarity. The WSB was not a partner, it was a prison. And she had been living behind invisible bars. Now, she was done accepting her place in their carefully designed system. The desire to break free had grown beyond a vague yearning into a concrete objective, one she could almost feel in her hands when she thought about it late at night. She wasn't just planning to leave. She was preparing to strike back. Every ounce of her training, every skill they had drilled into her, would be turned against them, repurposed not for their benefit but for her liberation. It would not be enough to slip away quietly. If she was going to risk everything to take her freedom, she needed to make sure they could never reach her again. Could never pull her back into their shadowy world. That meant dismantling the pieces of their hold on her, severing ties, burning bridges, and exploiting every weakness she had observed during her time in their ranks. What made this transformation even more dangerous was the growing obsession that had taken root in her mind. It began as a simple need to protect herself, to reclaim control over her own life, but the more she thought about it, the more consuming it became. The WSB was no longer just an oppressive employer. They were the enemy, the obstacle between her and any hope of a life on her own terms. She replayed her missions in her head, recalling moments where orders had been altered without explanation, where outcomes had been manipulated to serve some hidden agenda. She analyzed faces and voices from her past assignments, filing away details she could use when the time came. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation, and every second she spent under their watch only sharpened her determination to be ready when she made her move. She began to change in ways the agency might not notice right away, but those closest to her could feel. She spoke less, listened more. Let people underestimate her while quietly mapping out their tells and their habits. Every superior became a puzzle to solve. What were their priorities? Where did they slip up? Who did they trust? And who did they fear? Every ally became a calculation. Could they be swayed to her side, or would they sell her out at the first sign of trouble? She hid her resentment beneath a layer of calm professionalism, but behind her eyes, every conversation was a battlefield and every detail was a potential weapon. Her fixation on freedom began to spill over into her personal life, into the moments when she should have been able to relax. Sitting alone at night, she would trace imaginary escape routes in her mind, mapping cities she could disappear into, contacts she could call on for temporary shelter. Places so far removed from the WSB's reach that they might not even bother to look. Other nights, her thoughts turned to more direct tactics, turning their own operatives against them. Leaking information in ways that would force them to focus on cleaning up their own mess instead of pursuing her. Dismantling pieces of their infrastructure one by one until their ability to control her was reduced to nothing. She knew the stakes were high. The WSB did not tolerate betrayal lightly. And anyone who dared to break away from them often found themselves hunted until they were silenced permanently. The risk was real, and she accepted it. In her mind, the greater danger lay in doing nothing, in continuing to allow them to dictate her life, to decide which missions were worth risking her safety and which lives were worth sacrificing. She could not go back to being that version of herself, the one who followed orders without question, who believed the ends justified the means without truly understanding what those ends were. Every encounter with Britt, every reminder of Vaughn's death, every whisper of the WSB's manipulation only fanned the flames of her resolve. This wasn't just about freedom anymore. It was about proving to herself that she was more than the weapon they had forged. It was about sending a message, that she could not be controlled, that she could not be bought. And that anyone who tried to use her would regret it. It was about reclaiming her own story from the people who had tried to write it for her. The obsession became her constant companion. She would wake in the middle of the night with a new angle to consider, a new vulnerability to exploit. In the field, her eyes scanned for more than the mission objectives. She looked for weak points in the chain of command, gaps in surveillance, operatives who were overconfident enough to slip. She knew that when the moment came, it would have to be fast, decisive, and irreversible. And she knew that when it was over, she might not just have her freedom, she might have the satisfaction of knowing she had outplayed the very people who had trained her to survive. For now, she played the part they expected of her, hiding the storm beneath a calm surface. But inside, Jocelyn was no longer theirs. Every day brought her closer to the moment she would step out of their shadow and into a life of her own choosing. And when that day came, The WSB would understand that the operative they had once commanded had become their most dangerous opponent, not because of the skills they had given her, but because of the fire she had built herself.